The United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were unanimously endorsed in 2011 by the Human Rights Council. Building upon the realization that states and businesses can both adversely impact human rights and address such impacts, the UNGP provides an operational framework for protecting and respecting human rights in the context of business activities and remedying adverse human rights impacts that may occur. They outline the implications of states' human rights obligations with respect to economic activity and recognize that businesses and enterprises have a responsibility to respect human rights, regardless of the size, sector, operational context, ownership, and structure. It also stresses the need for effective access to remedy for victims of adverse human rights impacts of business activities. Ensuring respect for human rights on a global scale cannot be achieved through the actions of states alone. All those who have the potential to adversely impact human rights have a role to play. The UNGPs underline the vital role of civil society organizations, human rights defenders, national human rights institutions, and other stakeholders advocating for human rights protection and accountability for harm, particularly those of populations at heightened risk of vulnerability and marginalization. UNGPs consist of 31 principles divided into 3 pillars that clarify the duties of states and responsibilities of companies in the field of business and human rights. The first pillar relates to the state duty to protect human rights. The UNGPs elaborate upon what this duty entails in the context of business activities, specifically noting that states' international human rights law obligations require them to protect against human rights abuse by business enterprises. The UNGPs recognize that states must take appropriate steps to prevent, investigate, punish, and redress such abuse through effective policies, legislation, regulations, and education. Pillar 2 sets out the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, which exists independently of states' abilities and/or willingness to fulfill their own human rights obligations. Business enterprises are expected to avoid infringing on internationally recognized human rights of individuals and communities with whom they come into contact, regardless of where they operate. The UNGPs detail how businesses, enterprises should conduct human rights due diligence in order to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address their adverse human rights impacts. However, even with the best policies and practices in place, adverse human rights impacts will occur. And where businesses identify that they have caused or contributed to such impacts, their responsibility to respect human rights requires active engagement and remediation. Finally, the third pillar of UNGPs covers the respective duties and responsibilities of states and businesses as regards access to effective remedy for human rights abuses. While judicial mechanisms are at the core of ensuring access to remedy, state-based grievance mechanisms, both judicial and non-judicial, or non-state-based grievance mechanisms, all have a role to play. Rights holders affected by business-related human rights abuses should be able to seek, obtain, and enforce remedies. That is, a range of remedies depending upon varied circumstances, including the nature of the abuses and the personal preferences of rights holders. Indeed, remedial mechanisms should be responsive to the diverse experiences and expectations of rights holders. Remedies must be to the victims and may include apologies, restitution, rehabilitation, financial or non-financial compensation, and punitive sanctions, as well as the prevention of harm through, for example, injunctions or guarantees of non-repetition. According to international standards, remedies need to be adequate, effective, and prompt. In 2021, marking the 10th anniversary of UNGPs, the working group presented the UNGPs 10+ roadmap for the next decade. The aim of the roadmap is to set out how the UNGPs can be translated to practice over the next decade, so as to achieve tangible results for affected individuals and communities, and thereby also contributing to a socially sustainable globalization.